Welcome all. I've got a bit of a divisive topic today. I want to talk about two subjects. One is HDMI versus SDI, and the other one is SSDs versus CFast versus SD cards. I've had various discussions over the years, maybe, certainly recently, about those particular formats, and there's a lot of angst generated about those particular formats that are used in video cameras and so forth. I just want to put out the outset, talking about HDMI versus SDI first. Yes, I recognise that SDI is a generally professional format of cabling or connection to cameras and other devices. It is generally a more robust system, being just a simple BNC connector and coax cable, being used for forever virtually on all sorts of equipment and so forth where you want connections to stay put and so on. And pretty much all of the professional sets where they lay out long lengths of cable and so on will be using SDI connections. And also they'll use SDI in shorter connections as well, such from cameras to monitors and so on, and other devices. So it's a recognised format that in many cases is superior to HDMI, but it doesn't mean that HDMI is a complete bag of shit like some profess. And I don't think all people have the view that HDMI is complete crap. It's not designed for heavy duty use necessarily. I don't think it's really designed to be constantly pulled in and out like a BNC connector is designed to do. And I think the main reason that a lot of people hate HDMI is that it doesn't have a locking mechanism like the BNC connector, which is sort of a bayonet type connection which will not come off unless you intend it to come off. But that's not entirely true. There are HDMI cables now that the connectors do have a built-in sort of locking mechanism. Clearly not as sturdy as the SDI connection, there's no denying that, but they're not prone to just falling out like some seem to intimate, that just setting it down somewhere will mean the cable's just going to pop off. And so there's a lot of sort of, my view, myths about it rather than looking at it from a practical perspective. And you have to look at it from a practical perspective because a lot of cameras don't have SDI outputs. Blackmagic 4K, 6K and 6K Pro, they do not have an SDI output. My monitor, the Blackmagic one, has two micro SDI inputs and an input and output, as well as HDMI. But I'm not going to connect that to the camera because there's no connection via SDI. And the HDMI connection that I do use works perfectly. It has never come out. It has never even looked like coming out. When I showed my previous video, shaking the camera about and all that, it's not going to come out. It's stuck in there, it's locked in there, it's a positive connection. And in my view, it's all to do with your cable management, as I've spoken many times before. If you're using connections that are potentially likely to be more prone to being disconnected, especially if you're rather haphazard with your the way you use gear, and I use that reservedly, make sure your cable management is up to speed and things will be safe. You don't necessarily need SDI just to prevent cables coming undone. If you use cable locks like I have on my cage, the HDMI port as well as the USB port are both locked in. The USB port's locked into the SSD itself that resides there, and the cable that goes into the monitor is a very secure one, which is not actually easy to pull out. There is no way that it's going to come accidentally out. So there's some of the factors that you've got to consider when you're looking at particular cable formats. And if you're using a Pocket 4K or any other camera that doesn't have SDI, you're stuck with HDMI. And in the worst case, you'll be stuck with micro HDMI, as some mirrorless cameras have. And they are bad, I'll admit, they're terrible. I've broken them in the past. The most minor knock and the connection is gone. Luckily, I haven't damaged the connection into the camera, just the cable end itself. And I do hate those, and I think micro SDI should be virtually banned. The mini HDMI is a little bit stronger, but the full HDMI cables are actually quite good. Some of the other criticisms about HDMI come that you can't have long cable lengths. Not so true anymore. You can get the fibre, or I think it's called a fibre HDMI, which actually goes up to about 100 metres without any amplifiers required or anything else. It's a monodirectional cable, but for most users that's all you need. I'm not saying that should be a substitute now for SDI, but if you've got no other option, you've got an option to get long lengths of cable via HDMI. The other thing is too that a lot of professional systems are now going to wireless. The delay, latency in wireless transmission systems has reduced dramatically. Wireless systems allow much greater flexibility when it comes to positioning of camera gear, positioning of audio gear and all the rest. The hazards involved with laying out cables. SDI cables, that's one of the issues I didn't note, was because of the such solid positive locking on camera gear and others, if someone trips over a cable, they're likely to pull the whole camera rig down rather than having a cable disconnected. It has happened, it will happen again, and you could destroy tens of thousands, if not more, worth of gear because of a trip hazard and such. These sort of accidents do happen. I've even linked to a video where there's a US-based videographer who shows how he ties up his SDI cables because he tends to break the BNC connections all too frequently. So they're not that strong, even though some make out that they're the duck's guts. So this one issue that I've got is that people sort of make HDMI sound really bad and SDI sound really good when there's an in-between place for both of them. And the other things I think with HDMI, certainly at the moment, I'm not entirely certain of this, but certainly has been the case, they provide higher resolutions than SDI, so you can actually get higher resolutions, 4K and so forth, and probably 6 and 8K, though I think the later versions of SDI might support these higher resolutions and higher frame rates as well. So they're my sort of views on that particular issue. I did have a rather robust debate with a cinematographer on HDMI versus SDI, and we agreed to disagree. But I think there's a place for everything, and like with anything, it's the way you manage your equipment as to whether it's going to be working properly, safely and reliably, rather than just saying, I'm going to rely on this bit of kit because then I don't have to worry about anything else. And when you do that, invariably something will go wrong. And I'll bet that cinematographer has had plenty of accidents during his career caused or as a result of SDI cables being caught up in people's feet and whatever else. And so very few people actually admit that, because then it defeats their argument that one particular product is better than the other. So that's my view on HDMI versus SDI. And my other topic at hand, which has come up fairly recently, is SSDs versus CFast cards. Not so much SD cards, but I'll just sort of touch roughly on that anyway. Now, the Pocket 4K and the 6K and the 6K Pro all take an SSD externally through the USB port. They take CFast cards internally as well as SD cards. I'm not a believer in the CFast cards. People say that they're far more reliable. You don't run the risk of USB cables coming off and your recording being stuffed up and yada yada yada. As I noted just earlier, my USB cables are hard and fast locked in. They're not going to come out. I don't pull the USB-C cable out of the camera ever when I'm downloading files. I just pop it off the front of the SSD and connect a long USB cable that then goes to the PC and download the files via that. So if I'm ever going to break anything cable wise or connection wise, it'll be with the SSD itself, and therefore I'm not risking anything likely to happen with the camera side, which I believe there have been some issues where the USB-C port has broken. I think it's gone into the camera or some such, because all these USB ports are connected to a circuit board in the main. So I don't run that risk because, again, it's proper cable management, proper product management, and I've never had a problem with my SSD as far as recording capacity goes and all the rest. The CFast card argument is that it's far more reliable. You don't have cables dangling everywhere and all the rest. I don't have cables dangling everywhere. And they reckon that it has better performance capability. Now, the CFast protocol is a SATA. It's the same as the USB-C. The recording speeds, basically, capability are pretty much the same. I've tested the Samsung SSD on, I think, on all the formats, and I don't have a problem with that. The CFast cards, this is a compact flash card, which is very, very similar to a CFast, roughly the same size. In fact, it has a pin configuration that is a little bit different to the CFast, but not greatly dissimilar. It uses the same philosophy. There's a stack of pins inside the camera, a stack of holes here, and they're designed to mate. There are problems with that because these cards, if you get some grit or something or rubbish inside one of those holes, you're losing a connection. And in the old compact flash days, those pins that were in the camera, which were more prone to damage than the current connections with the CFast, a lot of people used to have problems. You put the card in, you'll have a bent pin or something, and things don't work, and it was a bugger to try to fix the pin. So there is an issue with that could cause problems. I'm not saying it does, but in the same token, if you Google CFast issues, there are a lot of people who have had CFast cards fail. So it's just another memory card. It's not really much different than what goes into the guts of a Samsung SSD or an SD card for that matter. It's a memory card, and there's no guarantee that it is going to be any more reliable than anything else. Most of the studio cameras of professional use, they either use CFast or a different form of SSD, which slots into a caddy, but generally they're much the same. There are heaps and heaps of recovery services available for CFast. Surprise, surprise. And so there's this persistent argument about one being better than the other. The other real issue with SSD versus CFast is cost and cost benefit of the two. I can get a 1 terabyte Samsung SSD for 150 Australian dollars. I can buy a CFast card for $800, $900 for 1 terabyte, or as a lot of people do, they buy 256 gigabyte cards. I'm not sure why, but they say because it's a safety factor. There are some CFast cards I've observed on Amazon or whatever that are slightly cheaper than the Angelbird ones, which are recommended because they are supposed to be the most reliable and best CFast cards available. Now, there's another bit of a conundrum there. If CFast is so good, you would think that then, well, any CFast card will do. But those in the game all recommend Angelbird cards, which are very, very expensive. So my view is, what are you going to prefer to do? Spend $150 on a terabyte SSD, or $800 or $900 on the equivalent on a CFast? I'd rather spend the extra money on other equipment that is going to enhance video production and so on, than just on a memory card that may or may not be fractionally better than a Samsung SSD. And that's the problem there. And also, CFast cards are now pretty much an old system, an outdated system, or whatever, because CFS Express is now the new standard for high-speed data recording and so forth. Because, as I said, the CFast and the SSDs are all SATA. CFS Express, I think, is PCIe, so you've got 550 or so megabits per second capacity with the SSDs and the CFast, the SATA format. PCIe, I think, goes somewhere up to close to 3,000 megabits per second as far as the data transfer goes. So they're being made for the big new cameras with 8K, 12K, whatever, because there's tremendous data transfer requirements. The SATA format or the SATA connection can only go so far fast, and with a CFast card there's no great benefit as far as speed goes, given a normal SSD. And the other thing is that when people talk about reliability, what do they use with their computers? A lot of them will just connect their systems to an SSD, be it an internal one or an external one or a hard disk drive connected to their PC. They're relying on that external to the camera, thinking that that's all safe, but in camera an SSD is not safe. Once you've transferred all your files from your CFast card into the computer or into a backup hard drive, you're relying on the same technology as is relied with the, say, Samsung SSD. And if you're doing that, then I'm sort of a bit perplexed as to why one versus the other is better, but in a different situation, which is storing data, it's all okay. So that's one of the big issues. And I've got with mine, I've got the Blackmagic monitor, which does recording, so I've got redundancy there. That's the big issue with most cameras is, can you do a redundant recording? Because if a CFast card or an SSD or an SD card fails, you've lost everything. At least with my situation, I've got 1080p ProRes recording being backed up all the time when I'm doing some recording. So that to me is the smart way of addressing things. And rather than spending thousands literally on a memory card, the money would be better spent on a good recorder or monitor that can also record. And some of them also take SSDs. Surprise, surprise. But that's my sort of point of view when it comes to management of technology, is you look at all the risks, you look at the cost factors, the cost-benefit analysis of what you're getting. A lot of people are buying very, very expensive stuff, memory card ones specifically, without gaining a great cost-benefit. They might sleep better with it and they might feel a little bit better when they're out in the field doing recording, but there is no guarantee that things are going to go right for them. You have to have that backup. You've got to be able to manage what you're doing. Cable management, all of that goes hand in hand when you're doing work outside, whether it's for yourself or for commercial use or whatever. So they're my views on that. I'm sort of steadfast about that. I can argue till the cows come home as to which is better, and I'm sure that we'll always agree to disagree, but you really do need to think about some of those issues before you start, especially recommending to somebody to spend that much money on a particular memory card, because for some people it might not really be any value at all, and those things are often overlooked. So that's all I've got to say for today. Very controversial subject, and I think it'll never be settled, but I just wanted to get it off my chest anyway. So on that note, I'll just say cheers.